I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine the Latest. Today, as Ukrainian forces continue to try to expand their lodgement inside Russia, we hear how a Ukrainian F-16 pilot shot down 6 Russian cruise missiles. And we also have an interview with General The Lord Dannatt, the former head of the British Army.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Tuesday, January the 7th, 2 years and 312 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by the executive editor for audio, Francis Dearnley. Let's start in Kursk. Citing geolocated footage published Sunday and Monday by Martin Chuitero, among others, and all links are going to be in the episode notes today, the US-based Institute for the Study of War assessed that Ukrainian forces have advanced in southern Berdyn, central Roskoye, Porozhnoye and central Novosnitsky. They're all about 15 k's northeast of Sudzha in Kursk Oblast. Russia's MOD and Russian mill bloggers said yesterday that Russian forces had repelled numerous Ukrainian attacks in the area, including a roughly reduced platoon-sized mechanised assault. Now, none of those claims can be verified. As you'd expect, it's a very fluid situation. It's very difficult to get any ground truth. But geolocated footage, as well as showing those Ukrainian advances, have also shown that Russian forces made gains to the northwest of Sudzha. So it's very, very fluid, very dynamic activity happening around Kursk at the moment. There were audible explosions near a Russian aviation technical base in Kursk City. Now, Kursk City is about 30-ish kilometres further on from where Ukrainian forces are, we think. That's out of direct tubed artillery range from Ukrainian positions in Kursk, and there are no verifiable reports of any destruction there. But a Russian mill blogger, and always, as we say, got to have a health warning with mill bloggers because we're not sure exactly who they all are, and they do sort of embellish things. However, a Russian mill blogger reported yesterday that Ukrainian forces had targeted Russian forward and rear positions in Kursk Oblast with missiles on a number of occasions. The Russian Kursk Oblast operational headquarters said their forces had destroyed 2 Ukrainian missiles in the area, which might lend some credence to the mill blogger's comments. There's also in Kursk extraordinary footage. You'll find it online. We're not running it. I don't think we're going to, for reasons that will become clear. There's extraordinary footage of a US-supplied Stryker armoured vehicle that's reportedly out of ammunition driving over Russian troops. Like I say, the images are on social media. We should put a graphic content warning on it. It is extraordinary footage. What I took from it, though, it was very striking that you got this, no pun intended, you got this Stryker armoured vehicle basically doing laps of a snow-covered field, totally exposed, completely open, and nothing being done against it. We think there's some small arms fire, but there's certainly no anti-tank guided weapons. And I'm just amazed that Russian forces in their own country do not have a ready supply of anti-tank guided weapons to have a go at this Stryker. It spends a lot of time driving around and driving over Russian troops. But like I say, that's all you need to take from it. If you don't feel like it, you don't need to go and seek out the images yourself. Sticking on the sort of Kursk offensive, but Harkiv, Ukraine's Harkiv Oblast military administration head, Ole Sibanov, he said yesterday that Ukraine's renewed offensive operations in Kursk Oblast have already reduced the number of Russian ground attacks in northern Harkiv Oblast in Ukraine, although that area is still extremely active. Sticking in Harkiv Oblast, going a little bit to the east, the town of Kupiansk, so about 50 k's southeast of Harkiv city. That area is still under extreme pressure. Kupiansk is on a crossroads of main road routes running north-south and east-west. It's also on the Oskil River, which for about 40 k's running due south is a very significant military obstacle. Now, Russian forces have reached the river about 15 kilometres south of the town of Kupiansk. They got there about 6 weeks ago and since then have tried to exploit north and south along the eastern bank, but to very little success. However, they are much closer to the city, only about 5 kilometres, if that, to the northeast of Kupiansk, but they're still on the wrong side, as far as they're concerned, the eastern side of the river. They tried pushing again yesterday, but were not able to make any advances, but did conduct strikes targeting crossings over the Oskil River in the area on Sunday night and to Monday morning. A Ukrainian brigade commander operating in that area said that even if the poor weather prevents Russian forces from deploying armoured vehicles because the ground's too boggy, or using aircraft or drones if the weather is not good enough, they are still sending infantry into the assaults without any kind of reconnaissance support. So still pushing on with those meat assaults. Now, a little further south into the Donbas, and the Russian MOD claimed yesterday that Russian forces have seized all of Kurakove. That's about 30 km west of Donetsk city, about the same distance south of Pokrovsk. Ukrainian Kryzia Group of Forces spokesperson Major Viktor Trebinov said there was ongoing fighting within Kurakove as of yesterday morning, but I think the town has fallen. There are reports Russian forces are in the power plant, which is right on the western end of that town. The town's quite linear, runs east-west along the south side of the reservoir there. The power plant's in the western end, and if that's where Russian forces are, then they've basically taken the town. If so, that will probably lead to that salient, the Ukrainian salient, which, I mean, we normally talk about salients as in an advance that one side has made into the other, a bulge, if you like, into the enemy lines. This salient's been formed by Russian forces surrounding largely open area, so no massive operational advantage there, but, tactical advantage in taking the ground. There's that salient about 10 km south of Pokrovsk. I think that's going to be taken. That could possibly put pressure on Velika Novosilka about another 10 km further southwest as Russia sort of consolidate the position there, which we'll keep our eye on, of course. Now then, into the Black Sea, and Ukrainian Navy spokesperson Captain Dmytro Pletenchuk, speaking yesterday, said Russian forces have absolutely covered the Kursk bridge with air defences and increased the number of fuel tanker trucks crossing the bridge, suggesting Russian forces are having to use that route for fuel resupply into Crimea by road and rail after Ukrainian strikes have hit the ferries and other sort of naval assets in recent months. That was the Navy. Ukraine's Air Force also speaking this morning. They said that for the first time in the aircraft's history, a Ukrainian-operated F-16 Fighting Falcon shot down 6 Russian cruise missiles during a single mission, including 2 with the aircraft cannon. This interception reportedly took place during a massive Russian aerial strike on the morning of December the 13th, just gone, which saw Russia deploy almost 200 drones and 94 missiles. Reporting in the Kyiv Independent says that the pilot reported that he approached a group of cruise missiles and, despite their electronic warfare countermeasures, managed to lock on to targets with missiles. The F-16 reportedly then shot down 1 pair of Russian projectiles with medium-range missiles, then another pair with short-range missiles, and then took down the last pair with his cannon, too close for missiles, switching to guns, I presume. Now then, ISW again, also reporting today, geolocated image published yesterday by Deep State, showing the aftermath of a reported Russian execution of 3 bound Ukrainian prisoners of war near Neskuchna, about 50 km west of Donetsk city in the Donbas. This supposedly took place on January the 3rd. Ukrainian officials have announced an investigation into the reported executions. And yesterday, Ukraine's Military Intelligence Directorate, the GUR, published purported audio interception, reportedly of a unit commander of the Russian 60th Motor Rifle Brigade issuing an order to execute a Ukrainian prisoners of war. The ISW assessment is that Russian commanders are either complacent or enabling their subordinates to execute prisoners of war, which obviously is a clear violation of international law. Connected to that, Ukrainian Human Rights Commissioner Dmytro Lyubinets said Ukraine and Russia have reached a preliminary agreement to conduct regular prisoner exchanges throughout this year. Speaking yesterday, he said these exchanges will include both military prisoners of war and civilian prisoners, and stated that Ukraine will prioritise returning prisoners who are seriously ill or wounded. Now, I'm not exactly sure what they mean there by civilian prisoners, who constitutes civilian prisoner, quite what's happening there, but I will keep an eye out. A few more for me. We reported yesterday about a suspected Ukrainian drone attack against the Russian port facilities at Ust-Liga. That's about 20 km inside Russia along the coast, the Baltic Sea coast on the border with Estonia. Well, Ukrainian outlet Suspilna, reporting yesterday, quoted sources in Ukraine's special services, the SBU, confirming that a Ukrainian drone or a drone attack struck and damaged a gas terminal at the Ust-Liga port, about 100 km west of Leningrad city. The attack was on Sunday night. The SBU sources say the drone strike severely damaged one gas container and also hit another 3. Now, we also reported last week about Ukraine's French-trained 155th Anne of Kiev Mech Brigade. Had a number of problems with desertion. We were told that this brigade went to France to train new recruits, so brand new recruits, went to train in France. 50 apparently deserted in France, and then more when the brigade came back into Ukraine. Well, yesterday at a press conference, Mikhailo Drapachy, who's the commander of Ukraine's ground forces, acknowledged these problems. He said, of course, this is a negative lesson, a negative experience, but it should be converted into some kind of preventative action. There are problems, and there were problems in staffing, training, and partially in the command staff. This is all consciously analysed, and certain conclusions have been drawn. The brigade was meant to consist of about 5,800 troops, but we think fewer than 2,000 actually went to train in France, and only 1,700 are said to have made it to the front line. That's Kyiv Independent reporting again there. And then just finally for me, before I hand over to Francis, British MOD are saying today that Russia has suffered nearly 430,000 casualties in 2024, up from just over 250,000 in 2023, casualties being killed, wounded, missing or prisoners of war. December 2024 was the highest month for Russian casualties. This is British MOD citing Ukrainian General Staff. The Ukrainian General Staff is generally seen as reliable enough to be used by Western officials. So December was the highest month for casualties, for Russian casualties, with nearly 49,000 casualties, and it was the 6th straight month of increased monthly losses. Now, British MOD here say today Russia will highly likely continue to experience high casualty rates over January 2025, with continued dismounted infantry attacks on multiple axes, as I was saying earlier on, around Harkiv. Now, just related to that, as anticipated yesterday, the Ukrainian MOD statistics today say that Russian casualties since the start of the full-scale invasion have topped 800,000. 800,000. On the other side, you may remember December just gone, President Zelensky said Ukraine had lost 43,000 soldiers killed in action and 370,000 wounded since the start of the full-scale invasion, so just over 400,000, so about half the Russian figure. Of note, in February last year, President Zelensky said Kyiv had lost 31,000 troops killed. So, quick maths. That's an extra 12,000 Ukrainian soldiers killed in 10 months. Obviously, just over 1,000 dead a month, roughly 30 a day. Now, if you put wounded on that, and generally, very generally, you'll take 3 times as many casualties in an offensive, more in an urban environment, fewer in a defensive operation. But let's say with 30 killed a day, let's say another 90 Ukrainian wounded a day, that's about 120 casualties a day compared to the 1,500 average a month in November, December for Russia. I mean, extraordinary numbers. Anyway, we try to put some stats on where we can. Squeeze them hard enough, statistics will tell you anything you want to hear, but we try to bring in the stats as and when we can, particularly about casualty figures, and Ukraine mentions them so rarely, as you'd understand, but we try to shine a light where we can. Anyway, Francis, that's enough for the military updates. What have you been looking at on the diplomatic and political front?
Well, thanks very much, Dom. There's been considerable commentary in the world press about President Zelensky's 3-hour interview with podcaster Lex Fridman, picking up on many of the angles we discussed in detail yesterday. I won't repeat them here, but would point listeners to yesterday's episode if you want to hear a summary of one of Zelensky's most interesting interviews of the entire war. I keep finding myself returning to one of the questions that was put to him about non-NATO security guarantees or security guarantees without the United States as a guarantor. And I was thinking, if Zelensky truly believes there's no alternative without robust US backing, as he implied, then it would just speak to how weak Europe's defensive posture is now perceived to be. A continent where single countries produced armies that once subdued the world is now not considered powerful enough combined to act as a guarantor of peace on its own doorstep. Extraordinary, and I would argue untenable. Now, speaking of army sizes and Zelensky, the president has stated in the past 24 hours that Ukraine now has the largest army in Europe, with 980,000 currently serving, around 5 times more personnel than the next biggest, which is France. Now, the Russian army is technically bigger, of course, but not all of their forces are stationed in the European theatre. Hence why he's making that claim. Now, despite this, of course, there is still much criticism of Kyiv for not mobilising more of its young men, particularly for the infantry, and I imagine this will come up in our conversation later with the former chief of the General Staff here in Britain. It's too early to say whether we can expect any significant political realignments in terms of Europe's collective stance on Ukraine as we enter 2025. Capital cities are still yet to truly awaken from their festive slumbers. But the early signs are not exactly encouraging. French President Emmanuel Macron said yesterday that Ukraine has to have realistic expectations on territorial questions, saying he sees no quick and easy solution to the war. We hope to have Joe Barnes on again soon to hear his sense of the mood music in Brussels and whether they are receptive to the arguments of Andrei Sybiha, Kyiv's Minister of Foreign Affairs, of course, who's just put out a statement where he says, and I quote, "Now is not the time for Ukraine's partners to falter or tire. Weakness, compromises on fundamental issues or appeasement will harm not only Ukraine, but also the rest of Europe and the US. The path to peace lies through strengthening Ukraine and raising the cost for the aggressor. Strategic mistakes will be very costly in the long run. Russian aggression against Ukraine must be resolved in a just way to ensure long-term security for Europe and for the United States. For this, we need principled and strong leadership, capable of achieving peace through strength." Peace through strength, a rather neat way of summarising the apparent failure of European deterrence over the past few years. Now, I mentioned in yesterday's episode that President Zelensky stated he'd put a deal to President Trump where Ukraine would purchase $300 billion worth of weapons from America if the $300 billion worth of frozen Russian state assets seized by Western nations were allowed to be used by Ukraine to wage its war. Interestingly, this argument has some traction in Europe, with several senior British politicians just publishing a letter in the Times of London where they call upon the following, and I think it is worth reading in full. "Sir, the G7 should transfer all $300 billion worth of frozen Russian state assets to Ukraine to counter Russia's aggression, secure Europe, and impose accountability. Previous loans and emergency funding are not enough and leave Western taxpayers on the hook. Only using the assets themselves ensures that Russia pays for its crimes. It will also deter future conflicts by sending a clear message. Aggressors must and will pay. At least £25 million in frozen Russian central bank reserves are held in UK accounts, the highest known amount outside the EU. Decisive action by a financial and legal heavyweight such as Britain emboldens other countries to take similar action. She is well positioned to lead. Russia's war economy is stretched to its limit. Seizing the invader's foreign assets is therefore strategically vital. It is legal. It will not harm financial stability. This afternoon, the Commons will debate a motion urging the government to investigate taking this move. We, parliamentarians from the UK and allied countries, urge them to support it." Now, its first signatory is Dr. Mike Martin MP, who is on the Defence Select Committee and the Joint National Security Committee, and is also a senior visiting fellow at the Department for War Studies at King's College London. Listeners may recall we interviewed Dr. Martin about his book on how to fight a war back in 2023, before he was elected a Member of Parliament. And many listeners will also be familiar with his fascinating analysis on the war on X, especially in the early days. So he is an example of somebody who was a commentator in a war and now is actually an actor, as it were, in trying to improve the situation. Though, of course, to the point of the letter here, there are many individuals within Europe, perhaps even within Britain too, that are hesitant about using those assets because of what they perceive to be the ramifications for their assets in Russia. So, of course, this is why it hasn't happened before now. But it does feel like the pressure is somewhat mounting as the cost of this war only increases. Now, a couple more stories, Dom. Another of the interesting snippets from Zelensky's interview yesterday, as we discussed, was that the Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenko allegedly called Zelensky to apologise for the invasion from his territory, blaming Moscow. Well, interestingly, Belarus has issued an official denial this morning, saying Lukashenko did not apologise to President Zelensky for Belarus's involvement in Russia's full-scale invasion in February 2022. No apologies have been made by the Belarusian president to Zelensky for the simple reason that we have nothing to apologise for. Those are the words of the spokesperson. Now, according to them, Lukashenko and Zelensky did hold a phone call around that time due to the, quote, emotional reaction of Lukashenko's son Nikolai, who had the number of Ukraine's president. Wow. Now, I know who I believe, but chalk this as another episode of something where future historians will need to get to the bottom of. The Belarusian stance throughout the war has been interesting and perhaps a little bit underexplored, if I may say. So very much one for us to continue monitoring, I think. But I want to end with an appeal to our Norwegian listeners, which felt appropriate given the perennial question of Europe's commitment to Ukraine. It's from a listener called Chris. Chris, thank you very much for writing in. He asks, and I quote, "Pondering big questions like whether the West is truly interested in helping Ukraine win this war can be exhausting and depressing. So I thought I'd toss a slightly easier one your way. Why is it that Norway continues to allow Russia to occupy a chunk of the Norwegian island of Svalbard for their so-called mining activities? This might have been an uncontentious issue at one time, but times have obviously changed and Russia is no longer confining itself to mining coal, but instead has begun engaging in various provocative activities, including pushing for the launch of a scientific research station with several other BRICS countries, brazenly flying a huge Soviet flag and even the flag of the Donetsk People's Republic, and even using Svalbard as a jumping-off point for training missions for Russian and Chechenian special forces. I'm aware that Russia has certain rights guaranteed by treaty, but clearly Moscow is pushing the boundaries as much as possible. Is it not time for Oslo, backed by NATO, to push back?" So there you are. If you're an expert listening in Norway, let us know via the usual email address or to one of us via X, and we will read it out in a future episode. And just by the way, tangent, can I just say, you guys produce amazing writers. Karl Ove Knausgaard is probably my second favourite living novelist. If you're at home and haven't read his series of memoirs, I highly, highly recommend them. Just a wonderful series. If you're listening, Carl, big fan. But Tom, big love to our listeners in Norway. Look forward to hearing from you. But that's where we are in news terms as of 1 o'clock London time.
General The Lord Dannatt is a retired British Army officer and a former constable of the Tower of London. Commissioned into the Green Howards in 1971, he rose to be the head of the British Army in 2006. He was denied the top job of Chief of the Defence Staff, some say, because of his decision to go public over the treatment of serving soldiers and wounded colleagues, the perilous state of British military capabilities, and his belief, subsequently expressed publicly, that the 2003 invasion of Iraq was a strategic error of near-biblical proportions. He was not only a military chief, he was also a military parent with a son who served 2 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. He has therefore lived the profession of arms from almost all angles and has closely followed the war in Ukraine. Here is our interview. Lord Dannatt, thanks so much for joining Ukraine the Latest today. Looking at the war in Ukraine as it is now and in the potentially the near future, when does a military commander know their force is exhausted and the time for political negotiation has arrived?
Well, I think that's a very good question. And of course, that's the question of the moment, isn't it? There's a lot of factors in there. Morale, obviously, is a huge factor. But of course, it's these days increasingly the technology that's available and the equipment and the resources that are available are as important. Yes, it was Napoleon that said that the moral is the physical is 3:1, and that still holds. But actually, frankly, the big battalions still hold some sway. And I think technologically big battalions, and of course we're talking about the Russians to an extent, are a significant factor in this. But you have to look at this war as you've been doing over the last nearly 3 years. The casualties on both sides are quite extraordinary. And if you look at what's going on, as you are, in the Kursk region at the present moment, the last report I saw, about 38,000 casualties that the Russians have taken, 3,500 North Koreans, one's told now. The big question is, how long can this go on? Probably for the Russians, because of the way that they're recruiting and the way they're remunerating people on the far side of the country when they lose loved ones, probably for some time. But on Ukraine, population, as we know, is much smaller. They're trying to protect the younger part of their population. They want a future. They've got to fight for their future, but they've got to make sure that they're going to have a good future as well. So the issue of the moment at the start of 2025 is, should negotiations begin, and on what basis? And frankly, it's very difficult to see what basis for an ongoing, any kind of conflict resolution you can find.
I mean, how dangerous for a force still in contact with the enemy is that period when negotiations are either mooted or underway? And what's the worst thing a military commander could do at that time?
The worst thing that he could do is order an offensive when he knows that a large number of lives are going to be lost, when he knows that negotiations are underway, and it could well be that the piece of ground that they're fighting for may well be ceded. I'm just reflecting back quite a long way now to when the Dayton Peace Agreement was signed in 1995 in Bosnia. I was Commander of British Forces at the time. We had to hand over a large piece of territory around the town of Mrkonjić, which had originally been Serb, had been captured by the Croats and the Muslims, but then it had to be returned to the other side. Now, how do you motivate soldiers to fight for something when they know they may have to give it up for negotiation? I think that's a moment of great danger. And if there is a serious possibility of negotiations starting, then I think responsible commanders try and hold their positions and don't waste their men's lives.
But the converse to that, I imagine, if you look at the last few weeks, last few months of the Second World War, when it was obvious the German army was beaten, but there was still a lot of fighting that needed to be done. So from your former position as the most senior commander in the British Army, how do you motivate divisional commanders, corps commanders, to push their men forward, and women increasingly these days, knowing that they're still fighting and dying to be done?
I think your analogy to the end of the Second World War is fair up to a point, but there was no alternative for the Germans. I mean, we had laid down unconditional surrender, and frankly, apart from an individual surrendering and becoming a prisoner of war, there was no plan B as far as the German state's concerned. Again, looking at the situation in Ukraine, a number of us have been saying for quite some time, but I'm sure you've been covering this lengthily, as I know you have in the podcast, that we have in the West collectively been trying to put the Ukrainians in the strongest possible position so that they hold as many cards as possible when it comes to negotiations. And that I think is the common sense rationale for their incursion into Kursk in August last year. And quite understandably, they're holding on to that. If I'd been the commander of the Ukrainian forces going into Kursk, I would have captured as much ground as I could. I'd have looked very closely at it and decided what was the most defensible ground, dug in there, and then let the Russians throw themselves to destruction on my in-place positions. And I think to an extent that is happening. And if we're seeing any revolving door in the campaign at the present moment, the Russians are still bloodily pushing their way forward in the central region, but the Ukrainians are pushing, albeit probing attacks into the Kursk area. And why not?
From the perspective of a commander, were you surprised how long the Ukrainians managed to hold those positions?
Yes. Quite surprised that Putin didn't chuck more at throwing them out. But if one looks at the sort of units that the Russians are currently using, they've got some of their better units there who are being held to a pretty bloody battle. And again, one understands. We know the North Koreans are there. Was this at the invitation of the Russians, or was it the suggestion of the North Koreans? I've heard it suggested that actually the North Koreans offered troops to assist the Russians as part of their own negotiation, if you like, within their axis of evil or axis of whatever, to try and put themselves in a better light with the Russians in terms of that relationship.
Were you surprised at the European reaction or lack thereof to North Korean soldiers being on European soil. It doesn't seem to have really had a massive effect on support for Ukraine or indeed focused on defence matters, has it?
I think we've all sort of scratched our heads and shaken our heads over North Korean matters for quite some time. And it almost seemed like yet another bizarre thing that the North Koreans were doing. Why? There's no real logic in North Korean soldiers used to completely different climate and type of fighting coming and getting stuck in Europe, other than wanting to create a good impression and improve their standing with the Russians. And I think that probably is the explanation of it. I think with everything else that's going on, I think probably we rather just shrugged and thought, well, that's the North Koreans being North Korean once again.
But wider than that, I mean, we have North Korean troops fighting in Europe today. We have Iranian ballistic missiles landing in Europe today. Chinese dual-use technology, blah, blah, in Europe today. I don't understand why this is not making a bigger news in the podiums when our national leaders are being held to account on various subjects.
Well, I think you're right to be raising it now, and I think raising it as a question. And I think we can probably conclude that it is surprising that there hasn't been a greater fuss made and greater elevation. I can only put it down to the first explanation I gave you a moment or two ago, that we're so used to the North Koreans doing extraordinary things. This is another extraordinary thing that the North Koreans are doing.
Now, if I may quote some of your words back at you from a book a few years ago, Lord Dannatt, have you seen any strategic errors of near-biblical proportions in the West's conduct towards this war?
Well, the obvious one is the glacial speed of decision-making every time that it's been suggested and bid put forward by the Ukrainians that we should give them another set of resources. Whether it was anti-tank weapons initially, whether it was main battle tanks subsequently, whether it was more artillery, more air defence systems, longer-range artillery, longer-range missile systems, and permission to use them. Every time, and of course chuck in the F-16s and fast jets as well, every time one of these issues has come up, we in the West collectively have taken a very long time to come up with the answer, oh yes, you can have it. And I think the classic really was during 2023. If one reflected on the success that the Ukrainians had in the sort of Harkiv area in autumn 2022, when they did really manage to get under the skin, if you like, of the Russians and get some genuine manoeuvre and movement going on the battlefield, we rather hoped that the so-called counter-offensive of 2023, properly enabled with the right weapons and ammunition and the rest of it, in 2023 could have recreated that situation and even posited the position whereby the Russians might be defeated on the battlefield in 2023. But it didn't happen, because it wasn't until mid-late 2023 that the Ukrainian force was ready. But the Russians hadn't been sitting on their bums doing nothing. They had developed these extensive, deep lines of defence. So therefore the counter-offensive, when it threw itself against those deep defensive lines, just couldn't make any progress. I think that is a collective strategic error of near-biblical proportions inflicted on the Ukrainians by the West, notwithstanding all our fine words of support. Actually, those fine words were not matched by actions, and it's rather condemned the Ukrainians to this dreadful war of attrition that they are locked into.
I mean, the counter-argument would be that of escalation management, and you cite the Harkiv offensive in autumn 2022. It's been reported that was the moment when national security professionals think that Putin came closer than at any time to actually using a tactical nuclear weapon. So we can't completely take nuclear escalation off the table, say it would never happen. But do you think that fear of nuclear escalation has been handled appropriately, or is it just absolutely fixed the minds of Western policymakers beyond that which should be accepted on a nuclear escalation ladder?
Quite rightly, we are mindful that we're fighting Russia, which is a nuclear-capable country, and therefore there is the threat of nuclear use. But then you have to analyse it rather more practically. Even before we do that, I think I would say, let's remember the relationship between China and Russia. China is very much the dominant partner in that. And I think President Xi has put his hand on Putin's shoulder and said, look, what you've done in Ukraine has got us dictators a bad enough name. Don't even think of going nuclear. But I think more practically, unless Putin was minded to use a nuclear weapon in the middle of the ocean somewhere just to demonstrate that he could, on a practical basis, where would he have used a nuclear weapon? Yes, you say in Harkiv in autumn 2022, Soviet, now Russian military doctrine might have said when there's a breakthrough, you use a tactical nuclear weapon. But in the context now, the fight is going on in those 4 provinces, which they've said will be forever Russia. So why would you want to irradiate for the next 3 or 4 decades 25 square kilometres of forever Russia? It doesn't stack up. So we should be mindful of the threat, but actually just see him down on this one.
Now, throwing our vision forward somewhat, if we may, turning to the time when the guns have stopped firing, it took a long time for this country to do the right thing by those that have been harmed through their service and their families, and there's still much work to be done. Given the years of effort you've dedicated to such work, looking after veterans, families, those that have served, what advice would you offer to the Ukrainian authorities with this enormous issue coming down the tracks towards them?
Well, one understands that they have got tens of thousands of amputees. I've seen the figure of 80,000 being quoted. Talking to some Ukrainians not that long ago, and I was talking about what you're alluding to, the fact that we knew that we had to do more during the height of Iraq and Afghanistan. 1st of October 2007, Bryn Parry and I launched Help for Heroes in our flat, because we needed a national response, and we pulled on the goodwill of the British people to help and supplement what the government was doing. They haven't got that in Ukraine. They haven't got a tradition of charitable giving. They haven't got a tradition of actually looking after their people well. So I think they notwithstanding the fact that they are reluctant to conscript 18 to 24-year-olds because they're trying to protect the youth, they have got a huge problem amongst a very large part of their population who have served and have been very badly damaged. And this, apart from everything else, is going to be a major net drag on their economy. It's a big issue for them.
Looking at troops more widely, and of course in the European context, you've of course been very vocal here in Britain about the poor numbers in the British Army at the present and the way that politicians have approached that matter. What's your response when you look at it European-wide? What has happened to European deterrence and army sizes in your view, and how damaging is it?
Well, our country is not alone in, since the end of the Cold War, taking successive slugs of a peace dividend. And we've been doing it ever since the Options for Change exercise in the early 90s, and that has continued. And I think that's mirrored across other countries. Put that all together, it's not surprising that Donald Trump previously, and I'm sure he'll return to that theme, is putting pressure on European countries for us to take a greater share of responsibility, and that means funding for European collective security. And I'm afraid it's a challenge that we can't duck. The present government has got a huge number of pressures. This is the present British government. It's got a huge number of pressures or things that it's trying to fund. But it's often said, but it's not really taken seriously, that the first duty of government is to provide for the security of our people. And we are not doing it. There is a strong case not just to argue for 2.5%, but I would suggest there's a very strong argument for 3 to 3.5%. The facts I often quote. In 1935, we were spending less than 3% of defence, and we failed to appease or deter Hitler. When appeasement and deterrence had failed and war broke out, in 1939, we were paying 19% of GDP, and in 1940, when we were fighting for our lives, it was 46%. That's the disastrous cost of fighting a war. How much better it would be to pay the price of deterrence. And in the Cold War, we were spending between 4 and 5% of GDP. And don't forget, the Cold War never turned hot. That's the sort of figure we should be thinking about in this country, and encouraging other countries to be spending between 3 and 4% on defence, to have a really capable military force that Putin would not consider using his own forces aggressively again. That's the price of deterrence, and it's an important one to pay.
And of course, the Balkans, it was a major example of perhaps some of the hubris that Western countries had undergone during when the collapse of the Soviet Union took place. And we're just wondering, when you reflect on that, the conflicts in the Balkans and the horrific war crimes that took place during that time, has it surprised you how little war crimes have been discussed in this context? Because it was pivotal to bringing the West in various conflicts in the breakup of Yugoslavia, but it hasn't really been a factor in this war.
It hasn't, although certainly when the Russians were pushed back from some of their early gains, quite a lot of evidence and intelligence was gathered quite properly. But you can only have a successful war crimes process if you've got the potential criminals in the dock. Now, that's not happening as far as Russia's concerned. I gave evidence in The Hague against Milosevic, against Kursk, whose troops carried out the Srebrenica massacre. We could do that because we had them in the dock, and therefore we could bring evidence, we could bring charges, we could bring evidence, we could convict them, and they were put away. But we don't see Russians in the dock at the present moment. It's the victors that can seek the justice. And while the battle is still going on, the other side isn't available because they're still battling it out.
You speak there of victory. It doesn't seem likely that some of the ideas of victory that were articulated by Western leaders early on are likely if the negotiations proceed in the basis that are currently understood. What do you think is the most likely outcome of negotiations, let's say, if they do, as some speculate? I think personally it's to some degrees wishful thinking, but let's say that there are negotiations in the end of January, February. What form do you think any ceasefire could take in that scenario?
Well, assuming Putin remains the leader of Russia and Zelensky remains the leader of Ukraine, I can't see any common ground for the start of negotiations. Putin ideally wanted to have complete control of Ukraine and incorporate it back into Russia. As a minimum, he must retain at least that part of Ukraine that the Russian soldiers are currently occupying. Zelensky, on the other hand, has said that every square kilometre of Ukrainian territory is sovereign Ukrainian territory and it needs to be controlled, including Crimea. On that basis, those two opening positions are totally irreconcilable. So I can't see a realistic and practical set of circumstances whereby there can be a negotiated end. There might be an agreed stop. There might be an agreed ceasefire. And this, of course, is where you start to draw analogies with the Korean War of 1950 to 1953. That war stopped in 1953 and in theory could start again tomorrow, today, because there has been no agreed peace plan. I mean, that is why broadly on the 38th parallel on the Korean Peninsula, you've got the line of demarcation with the North Koreans and the nutty North Koreans in the north and the South Koreans going through their own troubles in the south. But that war was never settled. It just stopped. Now, the trouble is, if you decide, or if it is decided to at least spare Russian and Ukrainian lives, that this war should stop, where does that put wider security in Europe? If you were a Finn, if you were a Pole, I was at the Baltic Military Conference a few months ago, where does it put the Estonians, Lithuanians, Latvians? It gives you a lot of very worried people. Why else would the Finns and the Swedes at this moment in their history have chosen to join NATO? They want to be part of a collective security, and you can't blame them. But if Putin is not faced down, if Putin's aggression is seen to be rewarded, then frankly, as a lot of military people are saying, give it 2 or 3 years' time when he has reconstituted his forces, he may well, particularly if we haven't stepped up our deterrent capability in the West in the meantime, he might decide to push again in the Baltics. He might decide to push again somewhere else, because that's him. Let's remember, what he's doing in Ukraine is not an end in itself. It's a means to an end. And the end that he wants to achieve is to put Russia back as a top superpower. And he'll do anything that he possibly can to try and weaken the West, weaken NATO. Scrape Putin to the core, you've got an unreconstructed KGB colonel whose beloved Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact was destroyed by the cohesion of the West in 1989 when the wall came down. He would love nothing more than for his epitaph to be the man who destroyed NATO. And he'll do it by pressing here, pressing there, pushing, and eventually bringing disunity in the West. So you have to see this is not just a fight between Russia for Ukraine. It's actually Putin's greater agenda for Russia, that he wants to see Russia as that strong power again, and he wants to weaken the West in order to achieve his aims.
So NATO collapses, and that's the mirror image of the Soviet Union collapse in his mind. That's interesting. Staying on this question of NATO, I was interested in, President Zelensky gave this 3-hour interview yesterday, and he said in that in his view, there can be, let me say he suggested it this way, based on what he said, that in his view there can be no meaningful security guarantees that Ukraine can accept that don't have the United States at the table. Now, there are risks, of course, around the United States, and Donald Trump saying that he doesn't want anything really to do with having troops on the ground in Ukraine as part of any peace deal, that it would be Europe's problem. Can you see there being a coalition of European states that would be willing to provide guarantees to Ukraine that would be enough to Ukraine? Or do you just think the willpower is not there? Is America still the key?
I believe America is still the key. And this, of course, is why we don't know from one day to another what Donald Trump is going to say. Yes, we know he wants to be the president that stops wars rather than starts them. He's spoken many times about stopping the Ukrainian war in a day, ideally on his first day. That won't happen. But I think what Trump and America do is very significant. But then what can Europe do? Well, Europe must do as much as it possibly can. I think implicit in your question is, could we see an international force composed of European countries, not with Americans involved, policing some kind of demilitarized zone between Ukrainian forces and Russian forces? Exactly. Well, you could actually argue that theoretically. Would Putin ever accept that? I'm not sure that he would. Maybe you then got to go to non-aligned countries and have Indians and Pakistanis and Brazilians and Argentinians doing that. That, I think, from Putin's point of view, is more likely. But here's a thought. If Putin was to agree that there should be an international force strong enough to properly monitor that 800-kilometre front line, and the UK agreed to be part of that, and let's say we agreed to take on 10% of the responsibility, the British Army is not large enough to do that. We would be exhausting ourselves as soldiers. Remember, if we deploy 10,000, that's effectively 50,000 in the way we rotate, 6 months deployed and 24 months training and other things. We did that in Iraq and Afghanistan. We were only trained, equipped and organised for one of those. We did two. We couldn't do that today. So our bluff would be called if it was agreed that we would contribute 10,000 to a buffer zone force in Ukraine. We would struggle to sustain that with everything else we're doing. That's a thought, Defence Secretary.
I have a couple more with one eye on the clock. Firstly, talking about the capabilities that have waned in this country and elsewhere around the NATO alliance. It seemed to be in decline for most of my 23 years in the military. But I was always told, even if the hardware is going, the intellectual capital is still there, and that's just as important. Stand fast whether or not it's just as important to have the intellectual capital. But do you think that is still there? Are we still developing leaders with the intellectual agility for a fight such as we've seen is still capable on European landmass? And do you think that we are ready to contribute, regardless of the material, but the people and the thinking and the pace of change that we've seen in this war? Has that been inculcated properly in the British military?
Well, Dom, you'll remember from your own military time, there are three components of fighting power: the physical, the conceptual and the moral. We've already in this conversation talked about the moral. That's the morale of our troops and their willingness to go forward even under adverse circumstances. We all know the physical bit is really important. Have you got the equipment, the ammunition and the rest of it? And in our case, no, we haven't. Your question is about that third component of fighting power, which is the conceptual. I believe that our conceptual fighting power is very strong. The quality of training and education amongst British Army and British Armed Forces leadership is very high. I think intellectually we are up there amongst the leaders. So the conceptual, I don't have any great concern about. The British soldier will always fight, so I don't have too many concerns about the moral side. But have we got enough equipment? No, we haven't. We're going to upgrade 146, I think that's the number of Challenger 2 tanks to Challenger 3, 2 regiments worth. I mean, the Russians have lost 19,000 tanks. Now, tanks aren't everything. But, and you look at the casualties in 2024 sustained by the Russians, just in the last year, they were losing between 1,200 and 1,400 a day. Well, aggregate that over the year, that equates to 7 times the size of the British Army. So we would have been throwing away a force equivalent to the size of the British Army every 6, 7, 8, 9 weeks. I'm afraid you can't get away from the fact we don't have enough. We have enough willpower, we have enough conceptual capability, we just don't have enough hardware of the most modern nature and the ammunition and resource to go with it. You can't win wars or deter aggression on the cheap. It just does not stack up.
A final question from me, if I may. Now, when we were both in Iraq together, you were very keen to make the point to our political leaders that we didn't have enough stuff then, and we were split between Iraq and Afghanistan as it was starting. And this was exemplified on a day when you were unable to visit various units in Iraq because there was no British helicopters available. But luckily there was a US Black Hawk that just happened to be there. Was that a complete accident?
I don't know. I'd taken Sarah Montague of the BBC with me on that particular trip, and we stood on the flight line at Camp Bastion, and I was expecting a Chinook and probably an Apache to escort it to take us up to Sangin, and 2 Black Hawks turned up. And she looked at me and I looked at her, and I just knew what she was thinking, because I knew what I was thinking. This is not going to look right, that the Chief of the General Staff of the United Kingdom Army couldn't be conveyed around in a British helicopter, and we had to use 2 American Black Hawks. And of course, Sarah made that story a pretty widespread story. Interestingly enough, it led to the first really meaningful conversation that I had with Gordon Brown on the issue of resources. And I think he got it shortly after that. General Dannatt came back from that trip with his shopping list. On top of that shopping list was more helicopters, and below it was pretty much everything else. And frankly, if I'm a broken record, and that was in 2009, this is 2025 now, 15 years on, I'm afraid that record still plays, and it's still cracked. You can't do what you need to do unless you've got the budget and the resources and the equipment. We've got the conceptual thinking power, we've got the morale, we've got the training, we've got the willingness, we just haven't got the stuff. And in some aspects of our defence budget, we've been spending it on the wrong things. Don't get me going on aircraft carriers. I voted against them in 2007, the Defence Board, because I knew if that carrier strike programme was fully funded, the Army's medium-weight armoured fighting vehicle replacement programme would be zero funded, and it was, and still is.
Final couple of questions from me. Lord Dannatt, you and I have spoken several times over the years from when I've commissioned you to write fascinating pieces of analysis, and feel very lucky to have spoken to you throughout this war on your perspectives. I know you quite often cite historical examples in your opinion pieces. I wonder, when you reflect on this war, what wars immediately come to mind for you when you think about it and its ramifications?
Well, I think there are 2. I've alluded to the figures which we did and didn't spend on defence in the 1930s. There are a huge number of parallels between what we are and we are not doing now and what we were and were not doing in the 1930s. The warnings were all there. There was the threat of aggression by a dictator in the 1930s, only the threat. What we have now is proven aggression from Putin. And are we listening to history as far as rearming appropriately and spending the right amount of defence resource on defence now? We're not. So in that sense, I fear we're doomed to allow history to repeat itself. In this conversation, we also talked about parallels with the Korean War. And 75 years on from the outbreak of that war, which is this year, we see a peninsula completely broken in half, with a war that stopped. It was never ended. There's no settlement. And I fear that we might begin to see that again in that eastern part of Europe. So analogies with the 1930s vis-a-vis Germany, analogies on the Korean Peninsula, I'm afraid I see them very strongly.
Thank you. And just one final question. Is there anything on your mind that should be on our minds and our listeners' minds that perhaps isn't being talked about enough in your view?
Well, I think it's, again, I've said it, I sound like a broken record. I think we just have to keep the conversation alive about, although it's difficult for a government to make decisions and to allocate the correct priorities, the need to properly provide for the security of our country, both at home and abroad, must be kept there very much at the top of the agenda. Now, there isn't enough money for everything to go around. Yes, of course, the answer is to grow the economy. I hope this government does manage to do it. It seems to be doing it completely the opposite at the present moment, but I'm an independent. I haven't got a political axe to grind on this one. But my concern is that we are not prioritising the spending of our national resources on defence sufficiently, and I worry that we will rue the day.
Lord Dannatt, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
A couple of final thoughts. I just want to pay tribute to an American I never met, a man called Chris. I know his surname, but I'm not going to say it, just so there's no chance of his family being contacted. But he was a friend of mine, both of whom served in their own armed forces and then served with Ukraine's armed forces. Well, Chris was killed day before yesterday, or I think yesterday actually, given the time difference of the messaging with me and my pal. Chris was a former US Marine Corps scout sniper. He dropped out of med school to fight in Ukraine. And apparently this incident, when he lost his life, he came under contact with his team. He extracted, but then went back into contact to help others who had become stuck. This was supposedly Chris's last mission of his last deployment. Now, we rarely highlight individual stories, as there are simply so many, and why one if not another, or not all. But, when it comes a little bit closer, we do what we can. So I would just like to mark Chris's service and sacrifice and say my thoughts are with his family and with my pal, who's a good friend to the pod. So if I may, Semper Fi, Chris. Francis, got any final thoughts?
Just a very brief one, Dom. Listeners will, of course, have been aware that we put out quite a few interviews over the Christmas period. And I just wanted to thank those who've written in to say how much they enjoyed the marvellous edit done by the team. I believe it was Rachel Porter on David's Christmas Eve episode of him attending a football match and looking more deeply about how sport and culture affects and helped a country at war get through trauma. If you missed that episode, I'd really, really recommend it. And indeed, there are a few others as well that you may have missed, which we'll add links to in the show notes, including one where there was an interview that we did with a lady who escaped what are now occupied territories, and another who was a beautician before the war, who then volunteered to educate children about the dangers of explosives. And I just wanted to draw attention to those because I know in the Christmas period it's a hectic time. People sometimes miss some things that they might otherwise find really engaging. And so I thought I would just flag those, and I say we will have a link in the show notes. But as I say, just mainly thank you to everybody who's written in, and I'll make sure that we pass it on to the team. It's a marvellous, marvellous episode, and I think one of David's best. So if you missed it, highly recommend catching up on it.
Yeah, I echo that, Francis. I mean, the David having a go at sports commentary journalism is, just a thing of beauty, especially when, as only he could, swapped his microphones over and then comes back and goes, "Oh, they've scored a goal. I missed it." Anyway. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on X so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it's released, do refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Knowles.